In the year 1218, a caravan of several hundred merchants and traders set out from the eastern steppe toward the frontier city of Otrar. They carried silk, silver, and something far more dangerous, a message from the most powerful man on earth. This was not a raid. This was not an army. This was diplomacy, trade contact between two of the most powerful empires in the medieval world. But in Otrar, someone was watching that caravan with something other than welcome. What happened next would set in motion a cascade of destruction so total, so precise, and so merciless that historians would still be counting the dead 2 centuries later. It began not with a battle but with a decision. To understand what was about to happen, you must understand the two men at the center of it. The first was Shah Muhammad II of Khwarazm, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the edges of the Central Asian steppe. Muhammad II had built, or rather inherited and expanded, one of the largest empires of the Islamic world. His armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. His cities were among the wealthiest in Eurasia. He believed perhaps that nothing could touch him. The second man needed no throne to project power. Genghis Khan, Temujin, had risen from the fractured clans of the Mongolian steppe to forge the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. He was not finished. By 1218, Genghis Khan had already subjugated northern China, crushed the Roman Elevensia, and absorbed or destroyed every rival confederation on the steppe. He now turned his attention westward, not yet in war but in commerce. The Silk Road was not merely a trade corridor. It was the nervous system of the medieval world, the route by which ideas, goods, and intelligence moved between East and West. Genghis Khan understood its value entirely. According to historical sources, Genghis Khan sent a substantial trade mission westward, merchants carrying goods of significant value, accompanied by ambassadors bearing his message. The message was one of peaceful commerce, of mutual benefit, of open roads. The caravan that reached Otrar was one of the most commercially ambitious diplomatic missions of the medieval era. It represented the Khan's direct reach into the Islamic world, and it carried his implicit expectation of safe passage. The governor of Otrar was a man called Inalchuk, sometimes referred to by his title, Qadir Khan. What motivated his next decision remains debated by historians. Whether it was greed, genuine suspicion of espionage, or the Shah's tacit approval, the result was the same. Inalchuk had the caravan seized. The merchants, numbering perhaps 400 or 500 according to various sources, were arrested. Their goods were confiscated. And then, in what can only be described as a catastrophic act of political recklessness, they were executed. When word reached Genghis Khan, he did not erupt in fury, or at least not outwardly. He sent an embassy, a formal delegation of 3 envoys demanding justice, the surrender of Inalchuk, and an accounting for the dead. What Muhammad II did next destroyed his empire as surely as any army could have. He had the Muslim envoy in the delegation executed. The 2 Mongol envoys were humiliated, their beards shaved, and sent back east carrying his answer. In Mongol culture, the person of an envoy was nearly sacred. Diplomatic ambassadors were inviolable. Their safe passage was the foundation upon which all communication between powers rested. To kill or humiliate an envoy was not merely an insult. It was a declaration that the rules of the civilized world did not apply. The envoys reached Genghis Khan. They told him what had happened. And according to historical accounts, the Khan climbed alone to a hilltop, faced the sky, and spent 3 days in prayer and deliberation. What came down the hill was not the man who went up. Genghis Khan announced his decision. There would be war. But this was not a rage-fueled raid. What the Khan began to plan was one of the most methodical, intelligence-driven military campaigns in medieval history. First, he needed to know everything. The Mongols were among history's most sophisticated users of intelligence. Before the first arrow was fired, they sent spies, merchants, and informants deep into Khwarazmian territory, mapping roads, measuring city walls, counting garrison sizes. Reading the politics of a fractured empire. What the spies reported was revealing. The Khwarazmian Empire was enormous, but brittle. Shah Muhammad II had alienated his own military commanders, antagonized the Caliph of Baghdad, and dispersed his forces across hundreds of fortified cities, rather than holding a mobile field army in reserve. Genghis Khan had fought fragmented powers before. He knew the formula. Strike before they can consolidate. Move faster than they can communicate. Hit multiple points simultaneously so that no commander knows where to send his reserves. In 1219, the Mongol army crossed the Surdaria, the ancient river that formed the eastern boundary of Khwarazmian power. The force Genghis Khan assembled was staggering. Estimates vary, but most historians place it between roughly 100,000 and 150,000 fighting men, supported by enormous logistical trains. The Khwarazmian border commanders knew something was coming. Riders had been reporting Mongol movements for weeks, but the reports conflicted. Different columns had been spotted at different points, moving in different directions, a deliberate confusion the Mongols had engineered. The Khan had divided his forces into multiple prongs. He himself led the main force. His sons Jachai and Chagatai commanded separate columns. And the great General Jebe swept wide to the south on a flanking arc that the Khwarazmians could not possibly block. The city of Otrar was first. The city where the merchants had been murdered. The city whose governor had lit the fuse. Now the flames were returning. The Mongols placed Otrar under siege. Inalchuk, the governor who had ordered the massacre, refused to surrender. He had no good options. Surrender meant almost certain death. Resistance bought time, but no more than that. While Otrar held, the other columns continued. Jachai drove toward the valley of the Surdaria. Jebe swept south. And Genghis Khan himself set his sights on Bukhara, one of the most celebrated cities in the Islamic world, a center of scholarship, trade, and faith. The approach to Bukhara was not the most direct route into Khwarazmian territory. To reach it, the Mongols crossed the Kizilkum Desert, a vast, brutal expanse that most commanders would have considered impassable for a large army. The Mongols considered it an advantage. When Bukhara's garrison commanders saw a Mongol army materialize from the direction of the desert, from a direction no one had thought to defend, the shock was immediate and total. The psychological effect of appearing from the impossible direction was itself a weapon. The Khwarazmian garrison commanders made a decision that was tactically understandable but strategically fatal. They attempted a breakout. They tried to fight their way through the Mongol encirclement before the noose tightened completely. The breakout failed. Most of the garrison soldiers who tried to escape were killed or scattered. What remained inside Bukhara was a civilian population, a small remaining defense force, and a city with no realistic hope of relief. The city elders of Bukhara chose to open the gates. They walked out to negotiate terms. Some historical sources record what Genghis Khan said when he entered the great mosque of Bukhara. Whether the exact words are accurate or legendary, the meaning was unmistakable. Genghis Khan reportedly rode into the great mosque of Bukhara, ascended the pulpit, and declared that the sins of the people had brought this upon them, that he was the punishment of God. Historians debate the exact words. No one debated the meaning. Parts of Bukhara burned. The citadel that refused to surrender was destroyed. Scholars, craftsmen, and skilled workers were separated from the general population. The Mongols had precise uses for talent. The city's fate was not arbitrary. It was calculated. Samarkand, the crown jewel of the Khwarazmian Empire. perhaps the most famous city in all of Central Asia. A city of 250,000 people or more. Towering walls. Multiple garrison forces. The place Shah Muhammad himself had chosen as his primary capital. Shah Muhammad II had placed a substantial garrison in Samarkand. Some sources suggest more than 100,000 soldiers of various types. On paper, it was one of the most heavily defended cities in the world. In practice, the Shah was about to discover how little that meant. The Mongol columns converged on Samarkand with extraordinary speed. Jachai's forces arrived from the north. Chagatai and Urgench closed from the east. Genghis Khan himself approached from the west. The city was encircled before its commanders could fully comprehend what was happening. For a few days, Samarkand held. There were sorties. There were skirmishes outside the walls. But the Mongols did not press a full assault immediately. They were patient. They waited. They watched the defenders' morale erode under the psychological weight of absolute encirclement. Part of the garrison attempted another breakout, a sortie force riding out to challenge the Mongol encirclement directly. The Mongols used a tactic they had perfected, feigned retreat. They broke the Khwarazmians pursued, and then the trap closed. With the sortie eliminated and the garrison's morale broken, Samarkand's remaining defenders chose capitulation. The gates opened. In a matter of days, the greatest city in the Khwarazmian Empire had fallen. The empire's heart had stopped beating. But where was Muhammad II? The Shah of the great Khwarazmian Empire, who had executed Mongol envoys and triggered this catastrophe. Where was he when his cities fell? He was running. Muhammad II had made a strategic decision that sealed his empire's fate before the Mongols even arrived. Rather than concentrating his enormous forces into a mobile field army capable of contesting the invasion, he dispersed them in garrisons across hundreds of cities. The reasons for Muhammad II's strategic passivity are debated. He may have feared that concentrating his forces would allow a disloyal general to challenge him. He mistrusted his own commanders. He mistrusted the loyalty of the caliph's political allies. In the end, he trusted no one, and that trust in nothing destroyed him. Genghis Khan received the news of the Shah's flight and made a characteristically decisive choice. He dispatched two of his finest generals, Jib and Subadeh. With a force of perhaps 20,000 men on a mission with no precedent in military history, hunt the Shah wherever he ran. What followed was one of the most extraordinary pursuits in military history. Jib and Subadeh chased Muhammad II across Persia into the west of Iran and ultimately to a small island in the Caspian Sea where he died, broken, sick, reportedly without even a burial shroud. With the Shah gone and his heir Jalal ad-Din rallying resistance in the east, the Mongol campaign entered a new phase, the systematic reduction of every remaining Khwarazmian city, fortress, and garrison. Some cities surrendered. Others chose to fight. The consequences differed catastrophically. Urgench, the old capital of Khwarazm, a city on the Amu Darya River, chose to resist. It was defended fiercely, street by street. The siege lasted months. The Mongols took it eventually. But the cost of its resistance was total annihilation. The fate of Urgench was recorded by multiple historical sources, and it was severe. The city's resistance had cost Mongol lives, and the Mongol response to prolonged resistance was systematic. Urgench was destroyed to such an extent that its geography was reportedly altered. The Mongols understood something that many of their opponents did not. The greatest weapon in a siege campaign is not the catapult. It is the reputation that precedes you. Cities that heard what had happened to those who resisted had a powerful reason to open their gates without a fight. This was psychological warfare on an imperial scale. The Mongols actively encouraged the spread of their reputation. Survivors of destroyed cities were sometimes deliberately sent ahead, to carry accounts of Mongol power to the next target. The terror was a tool precisely wielded. Merv, ancient Merv, one of the largest cities in the world at that time, a center of Silk Road commerce and Islamic scholarship, fell to the Mongols in 1221. According to historical accounts, the destruction of Merv was so complete it shocked even experienced observers who came afterward. The medieval traveler and geographer Ibn al-Athir, who lived through this era, wrote that the destruction brought by the Mongols was so great that he struggled to find words for it. He called it a calamity, unlike any other that had befallen the world since the creation of man. Nishapur, Herat, Balkh. Each city faced a version of the same calculus. Surrender and survive, though survival came at a cost. Resist and face the consequences. The Mongol machine moved with a speed and coordination that made relief impossible and resistance nearly suicidal. The Mongols were not simply cavalry raiders. By 1219, they had absorbed the siege expertise of northern China. Engineers, catapult operators, fire weapon specialists, and assault technicians. Cities that their ancestors might never have been able to reduce fell to Mongol engineering in days or weeks. The moment a wall was breached, the Mongol assault moved through it with practiced speed. Specialized units were deployed in sequence, first to secure the breach, then to drive to the citadel, then to prevent any organized counter-defense from forming in the city's interior. Not all resistance was military. Inside several Khwarazmian cities, the political dynamics worked against coordinated defense. There were tensions between Turkish commanders and Persian administrators, between the Shah's appointed officers and local power holders, between those who counseled submission and those who demanded resistance. The Shah's decision to scatter his forces was not irrational from a political standpoint, but it was catastrophic militarily. He feared that a concentrated army under a capable general could be turned against him by that same general. In trying to protect his throne from his own commanders, he made his empire indefensible. There was one Khwarazmian prince who did not run. Jalal ad-Din, the Shah's son, gathered forces in the east and mounted an actual military resistance. At the Battle of Parwan in 1221, he achieved something almost no one else had managed, a tactical victory over a Mongol force. Parwan was a tactical setback. It was also one of the last moments the Khwarazmian resistance would have to celebrate. Genghis Khan responded personally, leading his main force directly toward Jalal ad-Din in a pursuit that ended at the Indus River. Jalal ad-Din made his final stand at the Indus River, against an overwhelming force. He fought with extraordinary personal courage. Accounts describe him as a genuine warrior prince who commanded the respect even of those trying to destroy him. But courage alone could not hold the Indus. Jalal ad-Din escaped by plunging his horse into the Indus River and swimming across under Mongol arrows. According to historical accounts, even Genghis Khan pointed him out to his commanders as an example of what a son should be. But Khwarazm as a state was finished. By 1221, the Khwarazmian Empire had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning political entity. Its Shah was dead on a Caspian island. Its heir was a fugitive. Its cities were captured, destroyed, or in submission. Its army had been shattered across a dozen engagements. The campaign had taken roughly 2 to 3 years to dismantle one of the wealthiest and most populous empires in the medieval Islamic world. The speed of the destruction was without precedent. Nothing in the political playbook of the era had prepared anyone for what the Mongols could actually do. The destruction of Khwarazmian power had consequences far beyond the political. The cities that had anchored the Silk Road, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Urgench, were damaged or destroyed to varying degrees. The trade networks that had sustained them collapsed or were severely disrupted. While the Khan turned to other campaigns, Jeeb and Sube'etei continued their extraordinary circumnavigation. After pursuing the Shah, they wheeled north and west into the Caucasus, defeated Georgian and Cuman forces, and appeared on the Russian steppe, a reconnaissance that previewed the next great Mongol wave. What made the Khwarazmian collapse so total was not simply the military superiority of the Mongols, though that was real. It was the failure of political cohesion within the empire itself. A state whose commander-in-chief fled at the first contact with the enemy has already lost something that no army can recover. For the people who survived, life in the aftermath of the conquest was unpredictable. The Mongols had no ideological interest in eliminating populations wholesale. They needed subjects, craftsmen, administrators, farmers, and tax revenues. What they eliminated was resistance. Some cities recovered eventually. Others did not. The irrigation infrastructure of entire regions was damaged. The underground water channels that had turned desert into farmland, the canal systems that made great cities possible, were destroyed in some areas and not rebuilt for generations. The devastation of Khwarazm became one of the defining reference points of medieval Islamic historical consciousness. Scholars and chroniclers writing for generations afterward returned to it as the moment. The world they knew was unmade. The event entered history as a watershed. And yet, and this is essential to understand, the Mongols were not simply destroyers. Even as cities burned, the Khan's administrators followed. Trade routes were eventually reopened, protected by the Mongol postal system, the Yam, arguably the most efficient long-distance communication network the world had seen. Genghis Khan died in 1227, while campaigning against the Roman Zia in the east. He did not live to see the full consolidation of Mongol power in Persia, China, and Russia, but the engine he built continued to run with remarkable consistency after his death. The heirs of Genghis Khan continued what he had started. The Mongol Empire would eventually span from Korea to Poland, from Siberia to Persia, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It was built, in substantial part, on the ruins of Khwarazm. Let us return now to where this story began. Not to the battles, not to the cities, but to a group of merchants and diplomats on a road in Central Asia, carrying a message of commerce and peaceful contact between two empires that did not yet fully understand each other. The historian's question is not only what happened, but why. Why did Inalchuq act as he did? Was it personal greed? Genuine suspicion? Was it authorized by Muhammad II himself? The sources disagree. The consequences do not. And why did Muhammad II refuse to deliver Inalchuq to Mongol justice? That question may be the most consequential of all. Some sources suggest the governor was his relative. Some suggest he did not believe Genghis Khan would actually come. History is littered with people who could not believe that consequences were real until they arrived. What is remarkable in retrospect is how many warning signs Muhammad II ignored or misread. He had received accounts of Mongol military power in China. He had heard reports from merchant networks. He had envoys who described what Genghis Khan's armies had done to other powers. He chose not to believe it. The Mongols, by contrast, had done their intelligence work thoroughly. They knew the Shah had dispersed his forces. They knew the political tensions between his Turkish commanders and his Persian administrators. They entered the campaign with more knowledge of their enemy than their enemy had of them. It is important not to lose the human dimension inside the historical scale. Every city that fell was filled with people, scholars, merchants, weavers, physicians, poets, ordinary families living ordinary lives who became the collateral damage of a diplomatic murder committed far above their station. The craftsmen and scholars who survived the conquest were often relocated to the Mongol heartland or to the courts of the Khan's sons. Their knowledge was extracted and transplanted. The culture of Central Asia did not vanish, but it was fractured, scattered, and would reassemble in different forms over the following centuries. For military historians, the Mongol Khwarazm campaign is a masterclass in operational art. Multi-axis invasion, intelligence-driven planning, logistical sustainability across enormous distances, the weaponization of psychological terror, and the strategic exploitation of an enemy's political fractures. And yet the military genius would never have been deployed at all had the Khwarazmians not made the initial catastrophic error. No diplomatic violation, no war. Diplomacy is not weakness. It is the system that prevents the machinery of destruction from being assembled. Genghis Khan's envoys were not merely messengers. They were the physical embodiment of his political will, a projection of his authority across space. To execute them was not a policy disagreement. It was an act of annihilation against the very concept of negotiation. History remembers the Mongol response as revenge. But it was more precise than that. It was a demonstration to every empire in Eurasia of what happened when you violated the fundamental rules of contact between powers. The message outlasted the empire it destroyed. The cities of Central Asia that survived eventually rebuilt. Samarkand would become one of the greatest cities in the world again under the Timurid dynasty, a century and a half later. Bukhara would flourish as a seat of Islamic learning. Destruction is not always the final word, but that recovery was a century away. For the people living through 1219 to 1221, there was no narrative arc of eventual triumph. There was only the present, the sound of catapults, the smell of smoke. The confusion of systems of order dissolving overnight. Empires in the medieval world were less permanent than they appeared. The Khwarazmian Empire had been at its height for fewer than 30 years before the Mongols erased it. It had risen fast, on conquest and political marriage and opportunism. It fell faster. What makes this story endure across 8 centuries is its clarity. Cause and consequence align in almost brutal transparency. A diplomatic crime was committed. The consequences were measured, organized, and total. History rarely gives us a chain of events this direct. The walls of Otrar, the city where it all began, were reduced to earthworks. Today, the site is a low mound in the Kazakhstani steppe. Archaeologists have excavated it. What they find is ordinary life interrupted. Pottery, tools, the remnants of commerce. The Mongol Empire itself did not outlast its conquests by more than a few generations. By the mid-14th century, it had fragmented into rival successor khanates, each claiming legitimacy from the original source. Empires, too, are mortal. What remains when the empires have gone? The roads remain for a while. The languages and the religions and the stories remain. The genes of the people who survived remain. The lessons, those that history can teach, remain for those willing to learn them. The lesson of Khwarazm is not simply military. It is not only about the genius of Mongol strategy or the failures of Khwarazmian defense. It is about the consequences of treating diplomacy as something that can be discarded without cost. Inalchuq, who ordered the original massacre, died in Otrar. According to some accounts, molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, an executioner's answer to a man who had seen too much gold and refused to hear reason. Whether exactly true or legendary, the story reflects how history judged him. Muhammad II, who refused to surrender Inalchuq and refused to believe the Mongols would come, died alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, some sources say wrapped in a borrowed shirt and Genghis Khan, who prayed on a hilltop and came down with a decision, achieved what he set out to achieve. Justice in his terms. Demonstration in historical terms. And in the terms of the world that followed. The opening of Eurasia to a new age of Mongol-enforced connectivity that would last for a century. Empires are not always destroyed by weakness. Sometimes they are destroyed by arrogance, by the conviction that consequences apply to others. That the rules that govern lesser powers do not govern you. That a man who sends envoys can be answered with their deaths and face no accounting. The Khwarazmian Empire is gone. Its Shah is dust. Its cities, some rebuilt, some not. The caravans eventually moved again. The Silk Road eventually breathed again. But for a generation, an entire civilization experienced what it meant to be on the wrong side of the most consequential diplomatic insult in medieval history. They executed his envoys. They thought it was the end of a conversation. It was the beginning of the end of their world. If history has a recurring lesson, it is this. The systems that keep the peace, the rules, the protocols, the sacred prohibitions, are not weaknesses. They are the architecture of survival. Remove them, and what replaces them is not freedom. It is the storm. Explore more history on this channel. Every story we tell is built on primary sources, historical scholarship, and a commitment to letting the past speak without distortion. If this documentary moved you, like, share, and subscribe. The next chapter is already coming.